Today on the Ginger Engine, we read and review James the Red Engine, which was published on the 14th of September 1948. However, will our non-Thomas fan give this book a yay or a nay? Stay tuned to find out. Welcome aboard the Ginger Engine. First of all, we need you to check your tickets. How do you do that? By hitting that subscribe button and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos. We'll be sure to always keep the trains running on schedule. Today, your driver will be myself, Andrew Durning. Your fireman will be
Thomas Lawrence.
And you'll be travelling alongside our very important passengers.
Randall Martin.
Matthew Hill.
So, how are we all doing today?
Very well.
Very, very well.
Oh, good. We're on the third book already. Can you believe it?
No?
I remember when this idea just popped into my head and I thought, I wonder what Saddles will actually agree to this. And I didn't actually get Saddles, I got actual intelligent, performing, lovely people.
I'll pay you for that later.
Don't worry, that's why you're getting paid.
That's why I'm getting paid.
That's why you're getting paid. So you've had a chance to read the first two books and you've had a chance to let it percolate in your subconscious. How have you found the experience so far?
Fun, I would say, is probably quite a good way to explain it.
Is it fun because of the books or fun because I've made it fun? Choose your words carefully.
Both, Andrew, both.
Both of them, thank you. And what's how Matthew stayed suspiciously quiet there?
Oh, it's definitely been fun,
Yep, it's been fun. You've got
I still feel like we're just getting started,
Yeah, well, we definitely are. We've got 26 books, we're only into the third one, we've still got 23 to go. Thomas, how are you finding this being around? Not just only a fellow Thomas fan, but us helping educate the masses.
Honestly, I've found this quite a fun experience. I'm literally just knowing the fact we can get people back into Thomas again is just amazing.
Yep, it's great. I've had nothing but smiles on my face about it. It's getting to relive my childhood, but in a positive way. Yeah, like when people aren't telling me that I'm sad and I shouldn't be able to join Thomas, this has been really good. I can actually be a converter rather than trying to be converted back to the normie way.
Yeah.
But today we are jumping into the third book of the Dalby era, which is James the Red Engine. Anybody listening to the previous videos, first of all, make sure you jump into the playlist and listen to the first two if you haven't. But if you were listening to Thomas Tank Engine and Friends, James was introduced in Thomas and the Breakdown Train, and now he has gotten his own book. Very exciting! So how did James come about, I hear you ask? Well, that is why we have the learning segments from our one and only Luke Bainham, our Irish Thomas fan. We need to try and see if we can get an Irish engine just to name after him, because I'm only using like Luke from Blue Mountain Mystery for him. I'm not sure if because it's green, I don't know if he'll take offence to that, green, Irish, all that stuff. So we shall jump in and you can find out a bit about the learning with Luke. For James the Red Engine, after Reginald Payne couldn't return, Wilbert decided to illustrate the book himself. While he was unable to draw people and scenery, he found a solution in the new head mistress of the Knapwell Church School of England, Barbara Bean, whose hobby was sketching. Although she didn't know anything about railways, she agreed to collaborate with Wilbert on the illustrations. Wilbert drew the engineering side of things while Miss Bean filled in the scenic details and added watercolour to the illustrations. But by the time the illustrations were finished, Edmund Ward had already hired C. Reginald Dalby as an illustrator, and he redrew the pictures for publication. This is Wilbert's least favourite book, as he had to write the stories to meet a deadline rather than from experience. All four of these stories take place in 1925, which is the same year that the stories Thomas and the Trucks and Thomas and the Breakdown Train take place. It's also the same year when James first arrived on Sodor. James in the Top Hat is based on an event that occurred at Ghent, Belgium, that was witnessed by Wilbert W. Awdry. James in the Bootlace is based off a snippet in the Railway Gazette. From this book onwards, the Fat Director is called the Fat Controller. Due to the nationalisation of the big four railway companies into one big company of British Railways that happened in 1948, the same year this book was published, which was also made the North Western Railway and the North Western region of British Railways. Locations in the stories in James in the Top Hat: Tidmouth Sheds,
Dickerstown Sheds, Knapford, Gordon's Hill, Cronk, the Cow Field where James had his accident, and Wellsworth. Locations in James and the Bookways is just Tidmouth. In Troublesome Trucks, the locations are Tidmouth Sheds, Tidmouth Yards, Gordon's Hill, Kildare, where James delivered his trucks and is resting in a siding in the yard. In this book, Kildare is illustrated as Wellsworth, but in the book The Island of Sodor is People, History and Railways, it says that James took his trucks to Kildare. In James and the Express, the locations are Tidmouth and Tidmouth Sheds.
So that was learning with Luke. And one of the things I actually noticed, guys, was see in the previous book, like the Thomas Tank Engine, the very last story, the Thomas and the Breakdown Train, I noticed in the last illustration that Thomas and, I'm assuming that's Edward,
Yes.
like, both have lights on their funnels, but in the rest of the illustration, they don't have them. It was very rare for someone like Audrey, who was so pernickety, that he would miss a mistake like that.
I've got a feeling it's probably because, like, depending on what kind of trains they were pulling as well, because I think they were doing passenger runs, I think it was quite common for the engines to usually get the lamps for them, because obviously Thomas is coaches, and then I'm going to assume Edward is quite the same.
Yeah, and then as we're going into what these Railway series books, you also notice that note from the author now, as we go into them, so it's like he's writing to, he's starting to write to his fans. So I think we missed the Thomas one, but we'll start from the James one, and I'll just give it a wee read. Dear friends of Edward, Gordon, Henry and Thomas, thank you for your kind letters. Here is the new book for which you asked. James, who crashed into the story of Thomas the Tank Engine, settles down and becomes a useful engine. We are nationalised now, but the same engines still work the region. I am glad to tell you that the Fat Director, who understands our friend's ways, is still in charge, but is now the Fat Controller. I hope you will enjoy this book too, the author. There's some interesting points even just on that bit alone. For one, the sentence James who crashed into the story of Thomas the Tank Engine, that's a bit of a that's a bit of a mouthful, and not kind of a grammatically correct sentence. He's starting to bring in the real issues there now. It's saying, like, you know,
Nationalisation and stuff
the
like that.
nationalisation, yeah, that's quite interesting. And the Fat Director now has become the Fat Controller, which is how he's more commonly known
Nowadays,
I think
yeah.
when I
Nowadays.
talked about it earlier, I actually said the Fat Controller without even thinking. Because
Yeah,
this is the first I've ever heard the Fat Director.
yeah,
This was the first time I always just, I think I said Fat Controller.
Mhm.
Because it just
Yeah.
rolls off your tongue now, doesn't it?
it really does. Like, I remember when I
Like-
first read the books and that was the same. I was like, who's this Fat Director?
I know, is this a
and then he
different
becomes the
guy?
Fat Controller.
I'm interested. I'm assuming obviously the reason that he's touching on the nationalisation and stuff is because that's around the kind of time that the railways were nationalised in the
Yes.
UK. I'm just wondering, and I suppose time will tell at the end of the day, but you know how that actually impacts the storytelling, or is it just an anecdote, or does it actually?
It does start.
Does the controller's job change because he's now the controller and not the director?
Yeah, it does
Yeah.
start to feed in about the nationalisation in later books, as we'll touch on. One thing that I find quite interesting is he changes director to controller, but the guy's still fat. It's like he could have put, like, you know, like he went on a bit of a diet, like he started eating kale, and now he's the festively plump controller. Well, there's nothing like that. It's still very, like, he's got a promotion, but he's still heavy. So I wonder if that would have passed the censor at the time. I personally don't think so, but
Again,
like-
timing and context might be different as well.
definitely.
Like being a fat dude after like the Second World War and stuff like that, and rationing and stuff like that might actually,
Yeah.
like it does in other cultures, that you're actually fairly well off and stuff like that.
Oh,
yeah.
Because not a lot many people in post-war
I think
Britain
it's-
would have been fat dudes. Like,
No,
he's
definitely
really,
not.
like, again, he's really well dressed. Like, again, from the cartoons and things that I remember from being really young, he did look quite well off and quite posh.
Yeah.
In the way he's dressed.
Yeah, and you can tell, like, from when the Fat Director was saying, well, forbidden me to push, forbidden me to pull, like, so he definitely wasn't wanting to get his hands dirty.
yeah.
Like, he was like, nope.
He just likes to take the money.
Yeah,
Like
take the money and
a
run.
fat cat, like.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
very
Well, or essentially, like, if he's fat, it was take the money and wander.
Yeah.
But for our listeners. We've had our discussion, we've had a little bit of a quiz, and now we shall dive in to James the Red Engine.
James and the Top Hat. James was a new engine who lived at the station on the other end of the line. He had 2 small wheels in the front and 6 driving wheels behind. They weren't as big as Gordon's and they weren't as small as Thomas's.
You're a special mixed traffic engine.
The Fat Controller told him.
You'll be able to pull coaches or trucks quite easily.
But trucks are not easy things to manage, and on his first day they had pushed him down a hill into a field. He had been ill after the accident, but now he had new brakes and a shining coat of red paint.
The red paint will cheer you up after your accident,
said the Fat Controller kindly.
You are to pull coaches today, and Edward shall help you.
They went together to find the coaches.
Be careful with the coaches, James,
said Edward.
They don't like being bumped. Trucks are silly and noisy. They need to be bumped and taught to behave. But coaches get cross. They will pay you out.
They took the coaches to the platform and were both coupled in front. The Fat Controller, the station master, and some little boys all came to admire James's shining rods and red paint. James was pleased.
I'm a really splendid engine,
he thought, and suddenly let off steam.
Whee! Shh!
The Fat Controller, the station master, and the guard all jumped, and a shower of water fell on the Fat Controller's nice new top hat. Just then the whistle blew, and James thought they'd better go, so they went.
Go on,
he puffed to Edward.
Don't push,
Puffed Edward, for he did not like starting quickly.
Don't go so fast,
grumbled the coaches, but James did not listen. He wanted to run away before the Fat Controller could call him back. He didn't even want to stop at the first station. Edward tried hard to stop, but the 2 coaches in front were beyond the platform before they stopped, and they had to go back to let the passengers out. Lots of people came to look at James, and as no one seemed to know about the Fat Controller's top hat, James felt happier. Presently they came to the junction where Thomas was waiting with his 2 coaches.
Hello, James,
said Thomas kindly.
Feeling better? That's right. Ah, that's my guard's whistle. I must go. Sorry, I can't stop. I don't know what the Fat Controller would do with that meter on this branch line.
And he puffed off importantly with his 2 coaches into a tunnel. Leaving the junction, they passed the field where James had had his accident. The fence was mended and the cows were back again. James whistled, but they paid no attention. They clattered through Edward's station yard and started to climb the hill beyond.
It's ever so steep,
puffed James.
I've done it before,
puffed Edward.
It's steep, but we'll do it. It's steep, but we'll do it.
The 2 engines puffed together as they pulled the train up to the long hill. They both rested at the next station. Edward told James how Gordon had stuck on the hill and he had to push him. James laughed so much that he got hiccoughs and surprised an old lady in a black bonnet. She dropped all her parcels, and 3 porters, the station master and the guard, had to run after her picking them up. James was quiet in the shed that night. He had enjoyed his day, but he was a little afraid of what the Fat Controller would say about the top hat. James and the bootlace. Next morning, the Fat Controller spoke severely to James.
If you can't behave, I shall take away your red coat and have you painted blue.
James did not like that at all, and he was very rough with the coaches as he brought them to the platform.
Come along,
he called rudely.
All in good time,
the coaches grumbled.
Don't talk, come on,
answered James, and with the coaches squealing and grumbling after him, he snorted into the station. James was cross that morning. The Fat Controller had spoken to him, the coaches had dawdled, and worst of all, he had to fetch his own coaches,
Gordon never does.
thought James.
And he is only painted blue. A splendid red engine like me should never have to fetch his own coaches.
And he puffed and snorted round to the front of the train and backed onto it with a rude bump.
Ooh!
Groaned the coaches.
That was too bad!
To make James even more cross, he then had to take the coaches to a different platform where no one came near him as he stood there. The Fat Controller was in his office, the station master was at the other end of the train with the guard, and even the little boy stood a long way off. James felt lonely.
I'll show them.
He said to himself,
They think Gordon is the only engine who can pull coaches.
and as soon as the guard's whistle blew, he started off with a tremendous jerk.
Come on, come on, come on!
He puffed, and coaches squeaking and groaning in protest clattered over the points onto the open line.
Hurry, hurry, hurry!
Puffed James,
You're going too fast! You're going too fast!
said the coaches, and indeed they were going so fast that they swayed from side to side. James laughed and tried to go faster, but the coaches wouldn't let him.
We're going to stop! We're going to stop!
They said, and James found himself going slower and slower.
What's the matter?
James asked his driver.
The brakes are hard done. Leak in the pipe, most likely. You've banged the coaches enough to make a leak in anything.
The guard and the driver got down and looked at the brake pipes all along the train. At last they found a hole where rough treatment had made a joint work loose,
How shall we mend it?
said the guard. James's driver thought for a moment.
We'll do it with newspapers and a leather bootlace.
Well, where's the bootlace coming from?
Asked the guard.
We haven't one.
Ask the passengers.
Said the driver. So the guard made everyone get out.
Has anybody got a leather bootlace?
He asked. They all said no except one man in a bowler hat whose name was Jeremiah Jobling, who tried to hide his feet.
You have a leather bootlace there, I see, sir.
Said the guard.
Please give it to me.
I won't.
Said Jeremiah Jobling.
Then,
Said the guard sternly.
I'm afraid this train will just stop where it is.
Then the passengers all told the guard, the driver and the fireman what a bad railway it was. But the guard climbed into his van and the driver and fireman made James let off steam. So they all told Jeremiah Jobling he was a bad man instead. At last he gave them his laces, the driver tied a pad of newspapers tightly round the hole, and James was able to pull the train. But he was a sadder and a wiser James, and took care never to bump coaches again. Troublesome Trucks. James did not see the Fat Controller for several days. They left James alone in the shed and did not even allow him to get out and push coaches or trucks in the yard.
Oh dear,
He thought sadly.
I'll never be allowed out anymore. I shall have to stay in this shed for always, and no one will ever see my red coat again. Oh dear, oh dear.
James began to cry. Just then the Fat Controller came along.
I see you are sorry,
He
James.
said,
I hope now that you will be a better engine. You've given me a lot of trouble. People are laughing at my railway, and I don't like that at all.
I'm very sorry, sir.
said James,
I will try hard to behave.
That's a good engine.
said the Fat Controller kindly.
I want you to pull some trucks for me. Run along and find them.
So James puffed happily away.
Here are your trucks, James.
Said a little tank engine,
Have you got some bootlaces ready?
and he ran off laughing rudely.
Oh, whoa, whoa!
Said the trucks as James backed down on them.
We want a proper engine.
Not a red monster.
James took no notice and started as soon as the guard was ready.
Come along, come along.
He puffed,
We won't.
screamed the trucks. But James didn't care, and he pulled the screeching trucks sternly out of the yard. The trucks tried hard to make him give up, but he still kept on. Sometimes their brakes would slip on, and sometimes their axles would run hot. Each time they would have to stop and put the trouble right, and each time James would start again, determined not to let the trucks beat him.
Give up, give up. You can't pull us. You can't.
Called the trucks,
I can and I will. I can and I will.
puffed James, and slowly but surely he pulled them along the line. At last they saw the Gordon's Hill ahead,
Look out for trouble, James.
warned his driver.
We'll go fast and get him up there before you know it. Don't let him stop you.
So James went faster, and they were soon halfway up the hill.
I'm doing it. I'm doing it.
He panted. But it was hard work,
Will the top never come?
he thought, when with a sudden jerk it all came easier.
I've done it! I've done
He
it!
puffed triumphantly.
Hurrah!
He thought,
It's easy now.
but his driver shut off steam.
They've done it again.
He said.
We've left our tail behind.
The last 10 trucks were running backwards down the hill. The coupling had snapped. But the guard was brave. Very carefully and cleverly he made them stop. Then he got out and walked down the line with his red flag,
That's why it was easy.
said James as he backed the other trucks carefully down.
What silly things trucks are. There might have been an accident.
Meanwhile, the guard had stopped Edward, who was pulling 3 coaches.
Shall I help you, James?
Called Edward.
No, thank you.
Answered James.
I'll pull them myself.
Good, don't let them beat you.
So James got ready. Then with a
Peep, peep.
he was off.
I can do it. I can do it.
He puffed. He pulled and puffed as hard as he could.
Beep, 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 beep. You're doing well.
Whistled Edward, as James slowly struggled up the hill with clouds of smoke and steam pouring from his funnel.
I've done it. I've done it.
He panted and disappeared over the top. They reached their station safely. James was resting in the yard when Edward puffed by with a cheerful beep beep. Then, walking towards him across the rails, James saw Fat Controller.
Oh dear, what will he say?
He asked himself sadly. But the Fat Controller was smiling.
I was in Edward's train and I saw everything.
He said.
You've made the most troublesome trucks on the line behave. After that, you deserve to keep your red coat.
James and the Express. Sometimes Gordon and Henry slept in James's shed, and they would talk of nothing but bootlaces. James would talk about engines who got shut up in tunnels and stuck on hills, but they wouldn't listen and went on talking and laughing.
You talk too much, little James.
Gordon would say.
A fine, strong engine like me is something to talk about. I'm the only engine who can pull the Express. When I'm not there, they need 2 engines. Think of that. I've pulled Expresses for years, and have never once lost my way. I seem to know the right line by instinct.
Said Gordon proudly. Every wise engine knows, of course, that the signalman works on points to make engines run on the right lines. But Gordon was so proud that he'd forgotten.
Wake up, James.
He said the next morning.
It's nearly time for the Express. What are you doing? Odd jobs? Oh, well, we all have to begin somewhere, don't we? Run along now and fetch my coaches. Don't be late.
James went to get Gordon's coaches. They were now all shining with lovely new paint. He was careful not to bump them, and they followed him smoothly into the station, singing happily.
We're going away! We're going away! I wish I was going with you,
said James.
I should love to pull the Express and go flying along the line.
He left them in the station and went back to the yard, just as Gordon, with much noise and blowing of steam, backed onto the train. The Fat Controller was on the train with other important people, and as soon as they heard the guard's whistle, Gordon started.
Look at me now! Look at me now!
He puffed, and the coaches glided after him out of the station.
Poop, 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 poop. Goodbye, little James. See you tomorrow.
James watched the train disappear round a curve, and then went back to work. He pushed some trucks into the proper sidings and went to fetch the coaches for another train. He brought the coaches to the platform and was just being uncoupled when he heard a mournful quiet. And there was Gordon trying to sidle into the station without being noticed.
Hello, Gordon. Is it tomorrow?
Asked James. Gordon didn't answer. He just let off steam feebly.
Did you lose your way, Gordon? No, it was lost for me.
He answered crossly.
I was switched off the main line onto the loop. I had to go all round and back again. Perhaps it was instinct,
said James brightly. Meanwhile, all the passengers hurried back to the booking office.
We want our money back!
He shouted. Everyone was making a noise, but the Fat Controller climbed on a trolley and blew the guard's whistle so loudly that they all stopped to look at him. Then he promised them a new train at once.
Gordon can't do it,
he said.
Will you pull it for us, James?
Yes, sir, I'll try.
So James was coupled on and everyone got in again.
Do your best, James,
said the Fat Controller kindly. Just then the whistle blew and he had to run to get in.
Come along,
puffed James.
You're pulling us well, you're pulling us well,
sang the coaches.
Hurry, hurry, hurry,
puffed James. Stations and bridges flashed by. The passengers leaned out of the windows and cheered, and they soon reached the terminus. Everyone said thank you to James.
Well done,
said the Fat Controller.
Would you like to pull the express sometimes?
Yes, please, sir.
Answered James happily. Next day, when James came by, Gordon was pushing trucks in the yard.
I like some quiet work for a change.
He said.
I'm teaching these trucks manners. You did well with those coaches, I hear. Good. We'll show them.
And he gave his trucks a bump, making them cry.
Oh!
James and Gordon are now good friends. James sometimes takes the express to give Gordon a rest. Gordon never talks about bootlaces, and they're both quite agreed on the subject of trucks.
So that was James the Red Engine, the third book in the Railway series. Now, if you're a regular listener, you'll know we'll go into our review. We have the Thomas Fandom review, which is myself and Thomas, and the normies of Fran and Matthew. And as always, we will start with Fran and Matthew for their unique perspective on Thomas and Friends. So, what did you think of the book?
I didn't think that one was as good.
I agree, I'm not going to lie.
Oh, controversy, because James is very much beloved in the Thomas fandom. Don't get me wrong, I think he was a bit of a prick, but aside that.
Not even like the character seems fine and stuff. I just think the themes and the story itself is just a lot more straightforward. Like
Yeah.
that one certainly seems a lot more like just a straight kids book than the previous two. I think.
It was a lot simpler in terms of like getting into it and listening to it. I think reading it didn't feel like that for me. I think it felt quite busy for me reading it, but actually listening, like, so the language, there was a lot of language in it, there was a lot of talking in it, and a lot of he said, she said, and this happened, that happened, and very, very fast paced. But in terms of when you actually think of the context, there wasn't as much going on in that book as previous.
There wasn't as many characters.
No.
I think. I mean, even though like the first book it was centered around 3 engines, and the last book was centered around Thomas, but there was still, we had Gordon, and we had bits from Edward, and we had Henry involved in the story as well, and the introduction of James. This one, it was James, Edward, Gordon.
Yeah.
That was really kind of it.
Yeah.
Like, so it was kind of like it was going back to 3 railway engines type.
Aye.
Maybe. Do you feel maybe that's kind of maybe had a bit more of that because there wasn't as much of the previous characters we've got to know involved in the story?
I mean, it certainly seems just like a lot more focused on like James and like his kind of perspective, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I don't know. I still feel like there just isn't as much of like we were talking about with the other ones where there's like a moral to it. There's like like a lesson to be learned. I'm not really sure what that is in the
I
James
feel it
one.
wasn't as gripping this time round, and like you say, that there's nothing. I couldn't.
There's nothing
quite
that I walk
figure
away
it
and
out.
I'm still thinking about
Aye.
myself, like my questions that I'm asking myself after that. Like,
I hate to say the word boring, but I do feel that book was a little bit.
Yeah.
That's a
If
bit.
that's all right to say.
Of course. Of course. That's.
it feels more. I don't know if this is again like kind of them changing the first book was like about a group of engines. The last one was just about Thomas, who's obviously the main character for the season. And this one again, it's like it's specifically on one character.
There wasn't as much drama this time as the Thomas one.
Yeah. We'll see how it kind of develops as it goes along. But it's interesting hearing what the different kind of sides for it. Because in the Thomas fandom, like James, what I said, he's a very fan favourite character. And you don't get me wrong, when I did my top 10 kind of worst list, the infamous one that's gotten death threats, James was on that list, and yeah, that was one of the ones that everybody kicked off about. Because I wasn't a fan of him, and I'm still not a fan of James. I think because his character is more vain and cocky, and I'm not that type of person, but I'm more kind of introverted and kind of secluded.
Yeah.
A lot of the fandom like because that's the kind of person they want to be, where they can be like, look, I'm James and I'm awesome,
Yeah.
and I'm great, and I can do this and I can do that. And that's not,
It
and that's not really a British nature, I think. Well, we're not as brash. I think maybe it's why more American audiences take to James. Because they do have that kind of, not all of them, but they do have that kind of about them.
Yeah.
So I can kind of understand it. Yeah, because in the first one he's like very, I'm awesome, and then that awesomeness, that arrogance kind of turns into being petty and spiteful in the second book. just been like, I'm going to show you, and then he causes more harm than good. He gets shut up and kind of left to thinking his actions. So there is a character arc of him being, well, he's got that arrogance, and it turns into like mean-spiritedness, and he's got to kind of be humbled and learn from it. I said when I did the season 1 reviews on the series, I felt like we didn't really need the last story. I felt he never really needed that because he'd already redeemed himself in the story beforehand. Like he'd earned the trust of the Fat Controller back. Like Edward had gave him positive encouragement. Didn't feel like he really needed to have the other final story. It felt like it was more concluded. I understand that you need to also have like the respect of your peers, but we know from working environments you're not going to get on with everybody you work with.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's just like, it felt like it was just an extra story to pad it out, but to give it like the 4 stories as per like the other 2 books. What did you think, Thomas?
If I'm being very honest, this book was never actually my favourite out of all the Railway series books. It's just mainly because, like, okay, yes, it did give James a bit more of a character because we'd all like seen him come off the rails in the previous story, but like James, don't count for us guys, but James is not one of my favourite characters either, if I'm being honest, because it's just like he's too into himself. I mean, yes, it's alright to be confident, but it's when you then get that confidence becomes arrogance, and then you're just like, oh, I'm amazing, I'm brilliant, love me.
Like I said, I think that's maybe because of like the British way. We're more subtle with things. We're not as like out there of I'm awesome. We're more like, yeah, we do all right. We're okay. We're fine with that. We're good. Don't worry.
It's also like as well, I think the stories, if I'm being honest in this book, they're just a bit meh.
Yeah.
Because it's just like, I mean, yes, if we wanted to give James a decent character arc, then give him a good collection of stories.
I think the way they done it in the classic first series, where they put the first 2 stories together to make 1 episode, I think that works.
Yes.
And I think having it essentially as a 2-parter in my eyes, where he's got that kind of, the pride comes before the fall, and then he learns from it, and kind of redeems himself. As a 2-episode, kind of just streamline, and that's it. I don't think you need to worry about like the one with Gordon, as I've said. I do still generally enjoy it. I also thought the illustrations weren't as good as the previous 2. I know Dolby does get a lot of stick for that, with some of the illustrations that is consistent, like the faces are like huge in one bit and then tiny in the next, and it's like not really in proportion. I've always found that that's a bit of the charm of his. But you could tell what with the other 2 that he's done, that he took more time with re-illustrating the 3 railway engines, and with Thomas it was just kind of let's touch up and make sure things are okay. But his own style, I can see the appeal for kids, and I can see it's very vibrant, very colourful. Aside from that, I went as first. As first. So now we move on to Normie or Normie. Now that we've finished our railway reviews, it is time for the final decision. For those who may be new to the channel, first of all, go back and watch the first 2 and you'll know what it's about. But after every review, we get our very important passengers to give each railway series book a yay or a nay grading. And at the end, we tally up each grading, and for the final episode, we can determine once and for all what was the best era of the railway series. Fran, Matthew, you are our normies or normies. We shall let you retire and converse and come up with your decision. Welcome back, Fran. Welcome back, Matthew. Have you reached a decision?
I think we have, yes.
Well, I think I might be able to tell what the decision is. So we may not need the dramatic effect. So is it norm yay or norm nay?
It's a
nay.
A nay. It's a nay, everybody.
Can't win them all.
From Thomas and I's perspective, we can understand that.
Yeah.
Not everyone's going to be a home run, and I think it is a squarely nay. Even when we were talking about it and having the review, we all had that.
You knew where it was going.
We all had that vibe about it.
It's actually nice to see that it wasn't just us that felt that way, that actually you guys totally understood where we were coming from, so that was nice to know.
Yeah. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure in the comments a lot of the fandom will disagree with
Oh,
us as
yeah.
well.
Oh, yeah.
But that's the whole point. Everybody's
That's-
entitled to their opinions.
Yeah.
And especially if we're bringing some normies into the fold, they weren't all home runs, because if they were, Audrey wouldn't have had a problem with Dolby.
Exactly.
And that which is very well known in the
Yeah.
Thomas fandom.
Okay, good.
So I think we can wrap this episode up. I think it's been a very interesting one. Like the other two, we've been very woohoo. This one's like meh. I've still enjoyed myself. I've enjoyed the
Yes.
narrations.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely, it's been
Yeah,
good fun.
I've had a great time. Well, I really enjoy it. So sadly, my listeners, the Ginger Engine has to depart for another day. We are leaving the island of Sodor, but until then, this is your driver, Andrew Durning,
Byron Thomas Lawrence.
and our very important passengers
Fran Gilmartin.
Mark, you held.
saying take care, stay safe, bye bye.